The door we cannot carry anything through death, the deathless, and the practice of learning how to die. There's an old Zen saying, "Die before you die, and then there is no death." The first time I heard that phrase, I honestly didn't know what to do with it. It sounded poetic, mysterious, maybe even a little dramatic. But over the years, through meditation, sickness, funerals, monastery silence, hospital rooms, and simply watching the seasons pass across ordinary life, I've come to believe that the statement is not morbid at all. It's liberating. One of the strangest things about modern culture is how completely we avoid death while simultaneously being terrified by it. We hide it behind sterile hospital curtains, euphemisms, cosmetics, entertainment, and distraction. We speak of passing away, transitioning, or losing someone, but rarely sit directly with the fact that every single thing we love is impermanent. And Buddhism says good, not because suffering is good, not because grief is pleasant, but because the refusal to see impermanence clearly is precisely what binds us to delusion. The Buddha did not teach contemplation of death to make us depressed. He taught it to wake us up. The Buddha's radical instruction. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha taught Maranasati, mindfulness of death. He challenged monks who claimed they remembered death once a day or several times a day, telling them that true diligence meant remembering death constantly. One monk said, "I remember death with every breath." The Buddha praised him. That's an extraordinary thing to contemplate. Not obsession, not fear, not nihilism, awareness. The entire Buddhist path begins with seeing things as they truly are. And one of the most unavoidable truths is this: everything conditioned will pass away. The Buddha's final recorded words in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta were, "All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence." That wasn't pessimism. That was clarity. Impermanence is not a punishment imposed upon existence. Impermanence is existence as we ordinarily experience it. And strangely enough, the moment we stop fighting that truth, life becomes luminous. The shock of impermanence. I think most of us live as though we've unconsciously signed a secret contract with reality. Not yet. We know intellectually that death exists, but psychologically we imagine it belongs to someone else. Another family, another time, another body. Then suddenly someone dies. A parent, a friend, a teacher, a child. A diagnosis arrives, a mirror changes, a hand trembles, and the illusion fractures. The Buddhist traditions all approach this realization somewhat differently, but they agree on one thing: awakening begins when denial ends. The Tibetan traditions are perhaps the most explicit about this. In Tibetan Buddhism, contemplation of death is not optional philosophy. It is foundational practice. The great master Milarepa said, "My religion is to live and die without regret." And in the Lamrim teachings of Atisha and Tsongkhapa, practitioners are repeatedly instructed to contemplate. Death is certain. The time of death is uncertain. Only Dharma practice truly helps at death. This sounds severe until you realize what it produces. Urgency, tenderness, presence, not morbidity. A person who deeply remembers death becomes difficult to manipulate with vanity, greed, or status. Because what exactly are we clinging to? The charnel ground and the empty mirror. Early Buddhism often encouraged monks to meditate in charnel grounds, places where bodies decomposed openly. Imagine that, not as Gothic spectacle, not as horror, as truth. The meditator would observe bodies in different stages of decay and reflect, this body too is of the same nature. It will become like this. The point was never discussed toward the body. The body is not condemned in Buddhism. Rather, the practice dismantles intoxication with permanence. Zen inherited the same insight, though often in subtler ways. Japanese Zen masters frequently spoke of death with startling directness. Dōgen Zenji wrote, "Impermanence is itself Buddha nature." That statement changes everything. Usually we imagine enlightenment as escape from impermanence, but Dōgen reverses the equation entirely. Impermanence is not the obstacle to awakening. Seeing impermanence completely is awakening. Cherry blossoms fall, incense burns away, snow melts, relationships change, bodies age, and because they are fleeting, they are unbearably precious. Zen death contemplation therefore becomes less about analyzing death and more about inhabiting reality without resistance. In Chinese Chan literature, this same spirit appears repeatedly. A monk once asked, "What is the meaning of Bodhidharma coming from the West?" The master replied, "The cypress tree in the courtyard." That answer makes no sense until it suddenly does. Reality is already appearing and disappearing before us moment by moment. Birth and death are not events happening only at the beginning and end of life. They are continuous processes. Every breath is arising and ceasing. Every thought appears and dissolves. Every self we cling to vanishes almost immediately. The person reading this sentence is not the same person who began the article. The Deathless. Now here's where Buddhism becomes genuinely misunderstood. People often hear all this talk about impermanence and conclude Buddhism is nihilistic. But Buddhism does not say nothing exists, nor does it say life is meaningless. Rather, it says that what we take to be fixed, separate, permanent entities are empty of independent existence. And this realization opens onto what the Buddha called the Deathless. In Pali, amata. In Sanskrit, amata. The unborn. The unconditioned. This does not mean an eternal ego survives death. That's the crucial distinction. The Buddhist Deathless is not a metaphysical soul hiding inside the body like a ghost in machinery. It is the direct realization of reality beyond clinging, beyond conceptual fabrication, beyond the illusion of separateness itself. The Udana records the Buddha saying, "There is, monks, an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated. Without that, liberation would be impossible. But this unborn cannot be possessed. The ego cannot achieve immortality. The self cannot become eternal. Rather, awakening is the falling away of the illusion that there was ever a separate self to defend in the first place. That's why Zen masters speak of the great death. It is the death of the false center. And strangely enough, what remains is intimacy with everything. Orthodox Christianity and the remembrance of death. One reason this subject has always fascinated me personally is because I spent many years in Orthodox Christian monastic life before returning fully into formal Zen training. And honestly, the parallels can be astonishing. The Orthodox monastic tradition contains a profound practice called memento mori, remembrance of death. The Desert Fathers spoke constantly about keeping death before one's eyes. Saint Anthony the Great said, "Remember death and you will never sin." Saint John Climacus described remembrance of death as a daily death. For the Orthodox monk, contemplation of death strips away vanity and awakens repentance, humility, and dependence upon God. At first glance, Orthodox Christianity and Buddhism appear completely incompatible here. Orthodoxy affirms an eternal soul. Buddhism denies any permanent self. And yet, experientially, the practices often arrive in remarkably similar territory. Both traditions understand that ordinary egoic consciousness is intoxicated with illusion. Both traditions see attachment to worldly identity as bondage. Both traditions understand contemplation of death as transformative rather than despairing. And both traditions insist that one who truly understands death begins to love differently, more gently, more honestly, more immediately. The Orthodox monks would sometimes keep skulls in their cells, not as decoration, as instruction. Likewise, Tibetan Buddhist practitioners visualize corpses, dissolution, and the decomposition of the body not to cultivate horror, but freedom. Because if we truly see that we cannot hold on to anything, compassion becomes natural. We stop wasting time. What actually dies? This is the great Buddhist question. If there is no permanent self, then what dies? The answer is both simple and difficult. The constructed self dies constantly. The aggregates change continuously. Form changes, perception changes, memories change, consciousness changes. What we call self is a flowing process rather than a fixed entity. Nagasena famously explained this to King Milinda through the chariot analogy. A chariot exists conventionally, but when searched for independently, no singular chariot essence can be found apart from its parts and relationships. Likewise with the self. And yet experience continues, karma unfolds, causes produce effects, compassion matters profoundly. This realization does not erase meaning, it deepens it. Because when there is no fixed self standing apart from reality, then suffering is shared. Interbeing becomes obvious. As Thich Nhat Hanh beautifully said, we inter-are. Learning how to die before death arrives. Zen training often feels like learning how to disappear gracefully, not physically, not psychologically in an unhealthy way, but existentially. The endless project of defending me begins to soften, and when that softens, something extraordinary happens. The world becomes intimate again. Birdsong becomes enough. Tea becomes enough. Rain against a window becomes enough. The great spiritual exhaustion of constantly trying to solidify ourselves begins to ease. I think this is why so many awakened teachers seem strangely joyful while speaking about impermanence. Not because they deny grief. Buddhism never asks us not to grieve. Even the Buddha mourned deaths. But awakening removes the additional suffering born from demanding permanence, from a world built entirely from change, the real meaning of the deathless. The deathless aren't found somewhere else, not after death, not in another realm, not in abstract metaphysics. They are discovered in direct intimacy with this moment exactly as it is. The moment we stop demanding permanence from impermanent things, reality opens. This is why Zen masters laugh so much. It isn't cynicism. It's relief. The self we were exhausting ourselves trying to preserve was never stable to begin with. And what remains after that realization is not annihilation. It is boundlessness, the sound of rain, the smell of incense, the grief of losing someone, the tenderness of holding another person's hand, the awareness reading these words right now. Nothing can be held. And because nothing can be held, everything becomes sacred. Final reflection from the Backyard Buddhist. As I've gotten older, contemplation of death has become less philosophical for me and more immediate. Friends disappear, teachers age, bodies change. I hurt in places I didn't know I could hurt. Dreams shift. And yet, strangely, instead of becoming darker, the world has become more luminous. The Buddhist contemplation of death is ultimately not about dying. It's not morose or depressing. It is about finally learning how to live. To live without pretending permanence exists where it doesn't. To love without clinging. To care without possession. To awaken before the funeral party arrives. Because the deepest Buddhist insight may not simply be that all things pass away. It may be that what we truly are was never separate enough to die in the first place.